Welcome, everyone. Our topic today is researching cemeteries. So, what can the grave tell us? Well, the most obvious piece of information that we can glean from a tombstone is the birth and death dates of the person buried there. The location of the grave may also give us some clues as to the residence of the person buried there or other family connections in the same cemetery. Now, that's not a given. The person buried there may not have actually lived in the area or may not have family connections, but there's a high probability that they could have. Oh, if you're lucky, you might see a marriage date on a tombstone. Sometimes the children's names may also be noted, especially in combination stones, such as a wraparound on an obelisk. And even if it's not right there on the stone, the children may be buried very nearby. Spelling variations, either the given name or a surname may be spelled a little bit differently on a stone. In fact, my third great grandfather, his last name, according to our family stories and all of the other generations that we knew, were to be spelled Allender. Well, on his tombstone, it was spelled Allinder. Now, we assumed that the stone carver had made a mistake, but after seeing some documents that he had signed later on, it turns out that's how he spelled his surname. And it was the later generations that had added the E instead of the I. So be on the lookout for some spelling variations. You might get some clues as to religious, fraternal connections, hobbies, military service, and other iconography, which we'll go over in depth in just a minute. Now let's take a look at the profile of a stone. What kind of information can you gather just from stepping back and taking a look at the stone itself? One important thing you can learn is about the socioeconomic conditions of your family or of the ancestor that is buried there. Also, as we talked about, getting clues about whether someone lived in the area or their relationship to others in the area, relationships on one stone or in a surrounding plot is very important information to gather. What kind of stone is used? Is it a homemade stone like you see here to the right? Clearly, this is a piece of concrete that was then carved and usually while wet. And you can see that it was not a granite or marble stone. So that gives us a lot of clues as to the construction and how much it costs to make a stone. What words beyond dates may be noted on the stone? I mean, clearly we love when we find more words beyond just the dates, but go around to the back of the stone. Sometimes I've seen almost full biographies included on the back of a stone, and this is amazing information to find. What kind of images or iconography might you find? We're going to cover iconography a lot more in depth as we go forward, but please note any symbols that you find on a stone. What does the fencing or landscaping look like? Is the plot is it fenced off with elaborate iron fencing, which is going to give you some more clues as to again, the socioeconomic status of the family that is buried there? What kind of plants are buried there? We're going to cover that also a little bit more in depth. But that whole thing, step back from the stone itself, take in what that looks like around the stone, and this may give you more clues as you go forward. Very important information that may tell you something about the family. Again, plot location. We were talking about their relation to others that are buried nearby. So absolutely walk around that stone and the plot and take pictures of all of the people that are buried around this plot because you want to take note there may be significant relationships that simply exist because they chose to be buried around one another. And at the bottom of this slide, there's a quote from the book Stories in Stone by Douglas Keister. It says America's most unspoiled resource of historic architecture. And that is so true. When you look at these stones in cemeteries and graveyards, you will note that some of them are just so elaborately constructed, and there's a lot of talent and craftsmanship that went into the carving of these stones. So appreciate the beauty for what they are. And also, a little bit of a note, that book is here in our library, and it's honestly one of my favorite books, simply because it's small enough, not quite pocket size, but pretty close. It's a very narrow book, but inside is a name index and iconography image index that allows you to learn more about the different icons and little carvings that you find on the stone and how they may have different meanings. They may tie you back to a fraternal organization. It may just simply express a feeling that someone wanted on a stone. And we're going to cover that, as I said, a little bit farther down in this presentation, but it's one of those favorite books of mine that I love. So, things to keep in mind. Is the information on the stone correct? I know we've all heard the saying about, well, if it's written in stone, well, not as often as we like. Sometimes there were mistakes made and we need to be ready to encounter that. Is this really the final resting place of a person? Simply because you have a stone that has their name on it, they may not actually be buried there. Sometimes the stone is purchased before a spouse marries again and then ends up being buried in another cemetery. Just keep that in mind. Just because you see the name doesn't necessarily mean that they're buried there. What about the surface condition and the readability? That's always a big challenge, especially with the really older stone. You can get growths on there, you can get just total fading to where, the stone almost becomes one color. And to try to decipher the writing on the stone, the carvings, is a really big challenge. Now, a lot of people will give you different tips how to read those, from flour to shaving cream to all of that. And we all say, no, 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 please don't do any of that. Water sometimes will help, so you can pour water on a stone, but the best thing really is to take a mirror or something that will reflect light onto a stone into various angles. And so you can kind of simulate the movement of the sun and kind of highlight some of those deeper carvings and get a better read of the stone. So always please go with something natural. What about the writing and the language on it? In this case, this is one of my, I guess this person would be an uncle of mine. The family came over from Germany in the 1850s, and this was happened to be the first person that died after everyone had come over. And as you can see, his tombstone is actually written in German. So you've got the birth and death dates that have those prefixes that mean born and died in German, and the rest of the family is all in English. So this can also give you a clue to immigration, clue to their previous nationality before they got here, and that's always a wonderful thing to find. What kind of symbols and iconography do you find? And take the time to understand them. Take the time to look those up. They can be very important to the person who's buried there. By the way, is it a cemetery or a graveyard? Well, if it is next to a church, it is commonly known as a graveyard. If it's a standalone space, it's usually a cemetery. So, cemetery is place. Cemeteries became known for park-like setting early to the mid 19th century, and that design of a cemetery can be very important. These changed from the 17th and 18th centuries of overcrowded cemeteries with multiple burials in one plot. And in fact, a lot of European immigrants came from a place where, cemeteries were not large. And in fact, people may have been buried on top of each other. If you couldn't pay the taxes on your loved one who's buried in a cemetery, they may just bury someone right on top of them. So this early practice of European migration is they're more used to that style of burial. And so it wasn't until we start realizing with westward migration that, gee, there's a lot of land out here. So we don't really need to be so cramped when we bury people. And so all of those floral motifs and everything started coming into play. They started bringing in plants and shrubs, trees, pathways, grand statuary. This pastoral influence also found in rural or family cemeteries. You can see that as well, especially pathways and large grand trees. They're trying to create this atmosphere. The meanings of flowers are more widely known at this time, and they're not only included on the stone itself, but chosen for planting as well. This right here is one of those prime examples of the European overcrowding habit that I was talking about earlier. In this case, the Granary Burying Ground of Boston, Massachusetts. It looks overcrowded just from first glance, but you can still see some pathways in there, and so it doesn't look terrible. But actually, the interesting note about this cemetery is that those pathways were not always there. In fact, it was a much more haphazard construction or placement of the tombstones in such a way that it was very, very hard for them to mow the lawn. And so, as horrifying as it sounds, they made the decision to create these pathways. Yes, that means they moved the stones in a little bit of a manner so that they could form pathways, allowing lawnmowers to go between the stones much easier. Now, again, I kind of feel their pain there. That would be really hard to maintain as far as cutting the lawn and all of that with no pathways. But on the other hand, oh my goodness, they moved the stones. So again, kind of a horrifying story, but yet another example of that visual overcrowding that you get with the 17th and 18th century cemeteries. This is a grand example of that park-like pastoral setting that was being designed in the mid-19th century. This is from Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, Ohio. But as you can see, all the trees are very orderly, almost a formal garden-like setting. And yet, it's not quite formal. You know, you don't have a lot of geometric patterns. You've got more undulating pathways that kind of follow the natural curvature of the land. But you have large lakes and weeping willows. And keep in mind that the tree choices actually also meant something. You know, we often see weeping willow as a sign of mourning. So be on the lookout as far as what kind of trees were being planted as well. Here's another one. This is Evergreen Cemetery in Louisville. Again, you've got this lovely garden-like atmosphere here. You know, it's designed to be a pleasant place to come. It's no longer just a place of death, but a very pleasant experience when people go there. In fact, I think, you know, in a way, by looking at the Spring Grove Cemetery imagery, I think they did expect for people to want to go and spend time there, you know, with the lakes and the trees and beautiful park that is also full of a lot of memories for people. Now we're going to look at the iconography in stone. So the decade or century of the stone's creation is going to dictate what type of imagery you're going to see. From the 17th and 18th centuries, we get harsh symbols of death that include skeletons and skulls with wings, you know, reminding everyone that death is right around the corner and that time is so fleeting. And then we transition a little bit into more angelic type images, which is a little more flowing, softer forms of mourning, which then convey the hope and resurrection. Life pursuits or connections begin to become popular. Children receive special stones and symbols, so be on the lookout for that. This set of images right here, this is also from the Granary Burying Ground in Boston, but these are coming from your 17th and 18th century graves. And as you can see, especially from the lower level images, you see the early skull and crossbones or skull with wings. And right below those harsh images, you get carvings of the hourglass, which is signifying to those who are standing at the graveside to to remind them that time is so fleeting and that we're all really dust, and that we're going to follow them at any moment. So that message again is very, very harsh. Above that, you start to see a little bit later, you're going to see those skull images transform into more angelic imagery. So you still have some of the wings and the time is fleeting, but it's a little bit softer. It's a little bit nicer to think about angels perhaps leading people to heaven instead of just you're going to be skull and bones at any moment. So this is just one example again from more of the 18th century. And here we have another example of what I was talking about before. And there's something to note about this stone specifically. This is where I was talking about the skull and the wings and the hourglass. But this one is actually for three children of the same family. And it's also the 17th century instead of the 18th century. So this harsh imagery actually started really early. And as we move forward a little bit, even into the late 18th century, you're going to start seeing those softer images, softer emblems of iconography coming through. And again, we have not crossed over into the 19th century just yet, but you're already seeing this urn and an early representation of the willow branch. And even if you look very, very closely, you can see a lot of text at the base of the urn. And this talks about the parental love for this person who had died. In fact, it talks about that he never gave his father any grief. And so it's a memorial. You're starting to learn a little bit more about the life of the person. Instead of death being the inevitable, you are starting to see something that is devoted to the memory of that person that lived. And this is 1784, someone who died in the Continental Army during the Revolution. So this is a great example of that. So, rounding the corner into the 19th and 20th centuries, you start to see a lot of different shapes. It's no longer the same cookie cutter type shape of tombstone. You get really elaborate designs, and the iconography significantly changes. You start to see symbols that represent some sort of message, some sort of connection to the deceased, either an occupation, age related, religious symbols, fraternal symbols, sometimes popularity, sometimes simply a flower image or even a tree image, something like that will signify or have a meaning behind it, which we may not know today. Sometimes back, especially in the mid 19th century and all the way into the 20th century, there are catalogs that people are looking at when the grave is being designed for the deceased. So there are a lot of symbols that have specific meanings. And again, it's really great to grab a copy of some sort of book, like I talked about the Stories in Stone book, to just familiarize ourselves with what those things actually mean. Again, sometimes they're related to an occupation, as we see with the log gravestone here down in the bottom. And you'll see a lot of popular images such as the Grecian temples. And moving right along, you see even more elaborate designs placed on the stone, such as the one on the left, where you get the gates of heaven and the dove and even the stars. This can actually tie back to a female branch of some of the fraternal organizations that were popular at the time. And on the right, you see the hand pointed towards heaven, reminding everyone where Nancy has gone in 1878. And here you see at the top the Egyptian iconography that became popular in the early 20th century. Below that, you've got the hand clasped, which is emblematic of a relationship. Now, in this case, this is a great example because the hand to the left has a scalloped design on the sleeve, which would indicate that's the female, and the other one on the right does not. So this is a representation of the marriage bond or the relationship in marriage and how they were very, very affectionate, and yet they're parting. So they're parting ways. This is the last gesture. And the one to the right, this one's actually in Frankfurt Cemetery. I love this one because it's so representational of the heritage of this family. And you've got that clear Celtic cross and it's gorgeous. But yes, you even see things like that represented later on. The image to the left here is a clear fraternal organization symbol. And the one to the right is a zinc tombstone, which is, I've only encountered one of these myself before. They are out there. They were more popular in the late 19th century, earlier 20th century. But what's great is this is metal. This is a metal tombstone. And in fact, if you look at the animals, the lambs or the rams that's sitting there on the little inset panels, there are screws there you could actually pop out and put in different designs if you got tired of that one. So those are those are a great little Easter egg to take a look at in cemeteries to see if you can find one. So the great part about that is being metal, they have really lasted a really long time. And since they're not stone, there's no wearing away of the detail. So the detail stays really, really crisp with one of the zinc stones. And those are wonderful when you can find one. Here's another Masonic symbol, clearly impressed into the top of one of the tombstones. And here we have some imagery that we're starting to get very, very used to in the 21st century and late 20th century. The etching became a whole lot more fine. And in fact, some of them are almost mirror image beautiful because they're very, very fine granite etchings. And so you get some things, some imagery that is related to sometimes their hobbies. Now, this person was W.C. Fields Woodrow. So he related very much to the Hollywood actor W.C. Fields. And so they have etched that on the back of the tombstone. And today we're starting to see such elaborate imagery about hobbies or interests that you can get almost full landscapes with a cabin and their favorite fishing place or the type of car that they like to drive. Anything goes these days, and we're really, really starting to see great representations about the person's life instead of just memorializing their death. This is one that was very popular in the early 20th century, and you do see this a little bit later on. It's that inset little porcelain image of the person in life. And in this case, this was a married couple, and so their image has been placed there. Now, that did go out of fashion at some point in the mid 20th century simply because those do come out sometimes. It's great when you still find them. Always document those if you see them. They're fantastic. But sometimes they do pop out over time, and so they didn't retain the popularity. Here's some more images that you might find. These are actually all from Georgetown Cemetery. And again, some more. And in fact, the children imagery is always one that's very poignant. The child with the lamb on top of the tombstone there. And right next to it, you'll see the children coming to Jesus. So you've got that religious connection and yet a child's grave. So be on the lookout for phrases and poems that may accompany the stone or the iconography that you see. Sometimes they're really, really meaningful, as in the tombstone that we looked at from 1784, where the family has placed a very personal message below the urn, talking about how great of a son this person had been and that he never gave his parents any grief. Sometimes the phrases or poems are something from a catalog. They picked it out. They really liked it. One of the most popular that I have seen many, many times is the "Remember me as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you will be. Prepare for death and follow me." That one harkens back to the really harsh imagery that we saw before and the fleeting nature of life. But in a way, it's also a religious missive. It's telling everyone, you better prepare for the next life. So that one is very, very popular. Here's another one. Many, like us, sat here by this spring and left this life in the blink of an eye. We captured the whole world through our courage and strength, yet could take nothing with us to our grave. Again, preparing for the next life. And I love this one because this next one sounds very much like the pirate messages that we've heard in literature. So, blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. And that fits so well with that skull and crossbones at the top. I just love that one. So, when it's time for you to determine which cemetery your ancestor may be buried in, there are a few different places that you can find the information listed. If the ancestor died in a time period where death certificates were produced, there may be the place of burial at the bottom that can give you an idea. Now, that's not as straightforward as it sounds, and I'm going to show you why in the next few slides. Obituaries and funeral cards may also give you the location of burial. Local inventories of cemeteries that were taken by wonderful volunteers over the years, and I'm talking about pre-Find a Grave days, but Find a Grave is also a great place. Funeral home records can be a wonderful resource. If you determine that the funeral home that was in charge of your loved one's burial still exists, contact that funeral home. They may actually have the records for you. Cemetery records. If the cemetery is large enough and has their own records, then they absolutely would be a clear choice to take a look at. Church records. Again, we had talked about the difference between cemeteries and graveyards. So if there is a church right next to where your ancestor was more than likely buried, contact that church. They may have the records there on site. Keep in mind sometimes church denominations and buildings do change hands, so it may not be the same denomination that it was before, or the church may have went defunct. They may have closed down. If they did, and you can find out which denomination that church may have been affiliated with, you can go to regional archives that are based on that church affiliation to see if they've got some of the records in that regional archive. Or even check your local historical societies or library to see if someone had turned those records in. Online databases, we're very used to looking at Find a Grave and Billion Graves as possible resources for us, and those are wonderful, but always keep in mind they may not be 1,000% accurate, so just take some of the information with a grain of salt. So, you can also trace the ownership of land and if there's any local governance over a cemetery. Sometimes a larger cemetery in the middle of town might have some local governance that you can inquire with the local courthouse and the local authorities on that. Sometimes there's a county-wide governance. So sometimes counties have cemetery boards, and all of these are a little bit more advanced methods of determining where your ancestor is buried, but it's definitely worth a try. So death certificates. Remember I told you that death certificates were a really great way to determine where your ancestor may be buried. And for Kentucky, that's going to be anyone who died roughly 1911 through today. There's going to be a location of burial somewhere usually at the bottom of the death certificate. Now, this sounds pretty straightforward, but take that information with a little grain of salt because as you can see, I know exactly where this person is buried, but the location of burial is listed as Lenoxburg, Kentucky. This is also another death certificate for someone who's buried in the exact same cemetery. Now, this burial location says Foster Cemetery. Well, why is there a discrepancy here? In the first death certificate that I showed you, Lenoxburg, that is the location of the cemetery. And this cemetery has a crazy naming past because it lives on the border of two counties up in northern Kentucky. Now, most people in the area will refer to that as Lenoxburg Cemetery. And in fact, this is the one I was referring to where the first part of the cemetery, and it was literally a cemetery, was started on its own in 1876. Later on, because it was out in the middle of a rural area and they wanted to have some services out there, there was a chapel built. Well, then, also because it's a rural area, they turned that into a church. So there is technically a graveyard that developed around the church. And so this specific cemetery has multiple names. It is known as Lenoxburg Cemetery. It's known as Cemetery Chapel Cemetery. It is known as the Cemetery Chapel Christian Church Cemetery. It's also known as the IOOF Cemetery, which is that's the Oddfellows organization because they clearly buried some of their folks there as well. You'll get multiple names. Now, why does it say Foster? Well, it turns out that Foster was just down the road along the river. Foster did not have a cemetery. They buried everyone up at Lennoxburg. So Foster, that was basically the cemetery for Foster folks. And so again, it's more of a relational term than an actual specific place that you could look up and then go see it. You just couldn't do that. So again, these can be a little strange, but do a little local digging into that. If it's something that's not readily identifiable, call up somebody on the local scene and see if they can help you out, help you decipher that information. Obituaries. I talked about obituaries potentially listing where someone was buried, and that's wonderful. Pretty consistent, not always, not you won't get that 1,000% of the time, but a lot of times you will get that. Cemetery records. Now, cemetery records are going to vary in their makeup quite a lot. You know, that's going to depend on the local record keeping. In this case, this is an example of the records kept by Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati, Ohio. And what's amazing about this is that they had a lot of German immigrants that were coming in and settling in this urban area. And so many of them, if they died, you know, if they died single, they died young, or even older. You know, we don't always know the genealogy of some of those early immigrants that came in. These cemetery records actually are spelling out, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, they will spell out the parent's name of the deceased, which is amazing. And there's another clue on here that is important to us is the lot owner. So who is the lot owner and how are they connected to either the deceased or the parents? This gives you an entire fan network that you can research that may tie you back to the original group that came over or even where they came from. So, because of course you can actually get, you know, where they were born, a lot of that information. These are wonderful pieces of information. Databases. We had talked briefly about Find a Grave, Billion Graves, Interment.net. Some of the older ones, genealogy databases such as US GenWeb, RootsWeb. I know those two are a little bit sketchy as far as getting some of the information out, especially RootsWeb. I know that was purchased, and so sometimes the information is not always easily accessible with that one. But US GenWeb, that was a very early inventory site. A lot of volunteers putting in a lot of cemetery inventories in there, so I always still include that one. Family Search, obviously, Ancestry. Google Books is also a great place. Sometimes the cemetery boards published information about cemeteries early, pre-1924, which can be up there in its entirety. Sometimes even just the Google Books may have cemetery inventories on there. Library of Congress can also have some cemetery information on there. So especially if you're looking for images of some of the larger cemeteries. So as I had shown you images of like Spring Grove Cemetery and even the one in Louisville, some of those early beautiful prints and things can be in the Library of Congress. So if the cemetery is a large one and nationally known or even regionally known, they may have their own website. And like here's just an example with Arlington National Cemetery. It helps people locate a specific grave. And they even have a mobile app so that you can easily find the loved one that you're looking for. So that's a wonderful example of how cemeteries sometimes are putting up their own websites. This one was where I found the Spring Grove Cemetery records that I had shown you, the cards that were of those who were more early immigrants into the area. Now, this has been a really great site in the past years, but I will tell you, within, I'd say the past 3 years, maybe 5, it was a little more buried. The genealogy information was really, really kind of hard to find. You had to really spend some time in the website, burrow down into the various menus in order to find what you need. Now, recently, I have discovered just literally 48 hours ago on one of the Facebook groups, they were talking about how Spring Grove has moved to a pay model or a fee model to access this information. So I can't confirm that. I have not looked into that. Cemeteries may be going in that direction, just FYI. It doesn't mean the information's not there. It doesn't mean you can't access it. It just means it may be a little bit more difficult and might cost you a little bit. Here's another. This one actually is for Lexington Cemetery. So again, this is one of those kind of plug in the name and they can give you a location. So one of my favorite things to do when I visit a cemetery is I love to take a look at the flowers that are around. Flowers, trees, shrubs, anything that looks like old growth that may have existed or been planted near the time of death or burial for the person that you're researching. So always step back and take note of your family's plot. What is planted around there? Sometimes the plantings can give you the boundary line of your family's plot, and therefore you're going to want to take a look at everyone that's buried within that boundary line. Take note of the cemetery as a whole. We talked about the design and intentional planning or planting that also went along with the intentional planning. Take note of ethnic and cultural background of your family. So we had talked about that crazy Lennoxburg Cemetery, which is actually one of my favorite cemeteries in the world. I have so many family members buried there for many, many generations. And what's interesting about this is that this little space, there were several pockets of German immigrants that settled in those little valleys around Lennoxburg. When they designed Lennoxburg Cemetery, they intentionally planted with a path down the middle these beautiful pine trees. And it's just something you don't see in the area. You don't see pine trees around. You'll see cedar trees, you see all kinds of other trees, but they clearly planted these massive pine trees. And obviously, they weren't massive when they planted them, but they're massive right now. And I can't help but think that that wasn't an intentional planting to maybe give them a little bit of a reminiscence about where they came from in Germany. And so be thinking about any kind of cultural or ethnic ties that specific plantings may have. Again, look for the oldest growth varieties. The varieties and growth habits can give you clues as to oldest plantings. And in fact, sometimes an old rose bush, if you can identify exactly what kind it is, you can get an idea of when it was possible for that to be planted. So if that specific variety didn't exist until a certain time, then you know pretty much a window of when that plant might have been planted there next to your next to the grave. And again, don't forget about the trees. Look up. Don't always just look around the grave or the cemetery. Look up. Spring is my most favorite time to look for the plants related to the gravestones because so many of these cemeteries, as they are lovingly and faithfully being upkept by landscape crews, which we thank those landscape crews because they have a difficult job, but a lot of times they do amazing work. But before it's time to actually mow the lawn around the stones, spring is wonderful to see what growths are coming up next to the stones that have not been chopped down by a weed eater or lawnmower yet. So early spring, you're going to get bulbs, and bulbs definitely a habit that a lot of people would do. They would go out and plant a few bulbs around the stone, and especially it puts on a display for Easter, and it's a very religious thing to do in this case. Peonies are one of my favorites as well. But again, a lot of times, if you take a look at the stones, now it's not always the exact death date is the time of planting. It literally could be 10, 20, 30. It could be a next generation past. It could be a child, a grandchild that planted that next to the grave. So it doesn't automatically mean that it's that old of a variety, but it is evidence that someone cared enough to plant this variety next to a stone. And again, I was talking about boundaries. So as you can see, this tree was one that was planted in this plot, and you can see stone boundary pavers that are around the family plot. But of course, the tree is humongous and has grown up through the pavers, but just speaks to the fact that that was more likely an original planting, or one that they it was young enough that they liked it and they left it in around the pavers, but it's just gotten so big over the years. These two pictures are from that Lennoxburg cemetery that I was talking to you about. My family has had a long tradition of planting just flowers, shrubs, things that will come back year after year around the loved one's grave. And I've known this. I mean, I've known that this has been a tradition. Now, this is an image that goes back to the 1960s before I was born. So, this is my mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother. And they are standing at the gravesite where my great grandfather had been buried. As you can see, there's just the funeral flowers that are there, and they're trying to kind of clean that up a little ways after the funeral. Years later, you can see now my great grandmother has been buried there, and my mother took the hostas and planted those next to the grave site that you see on the left hand side. Now, the funny thing is, she always planted it on Pa's side as well, but it would never grow. And so the family story or the family joke was nothing would grow on Pa's side of the grave because he had a little too much alcohol in his system that to allow anything to grow or flourish there. So that was the running family joke, but obviously it usually had more to do with sunshine and shade and survivability for the variety that my mother picked. So remember I talked about spring being the most amazing time to take a look at early growths and how they can help you. There was a missing grave in our family. In fact, well, we have more than one. Who am I kidding? But this is one that I was just kind of intrigued by. So Mary Malinda Mockbee and the Allender Peonies. So she was born in 1865 and she died in 1879 of typhoid fever at the age of 14. This little cemetery, also in Pendleton County, actually, the burial range for those in this cemetery is 1844 to 1934. And some folks had reported that she was buried here, but the inventories taken or any records that we could find of the cemetery as early as 1940 did not list her here. Now, this cemetery, as you can see, the top image is the way that I first visited this cemetery when I discovered that it existed. There's a fence. There's a clear fence and a fence row. Now, there's several stones that are still standing, but over the years, somebody took out the fence row. And when they took the fence row out, the fence row had stones that had broken off. And instead of laying them down because they've got to mow the lawn, so they just would pile them into the fence row or stand them up along the fence. Well, when they took the fence row out, as you can see now on the right-hand side, this is what they did to them. And that's just horrifying to me. They stacked them on top of each other. They've got some lovely plantings there, but no one can view them. I mean, no one has enough strength to pick apart that pile to see if their loved one's stone is in there. So that's a really bad example of someone trying to care for a cemetery, but in such a way that it removes any loved one's ability to learn the information carved on the stones there. So, I know that Mary's parents were buried elsewhere. In fact, her father is buried in Indiana, and her mother is up in Lennoxburg Cemetery, in that cemetery on the county line. Her grandparents were in this cemetery, but also so were other family members. There was an uncle, a great uncle, some aunts, and cousins. And again, her stone would not be seen in years. And the citation for burial information was not specifically listed. So it was more of a rumor that she was buried here. But again, I didn't have any actual documentation to prove that she had been buried here. So as you can see, the image here on the right, these are her grandparents. And they died in like 1863. It looks like it's well maintained. There's some plantings there. But when I visited a few years earlier during the spring, I saw some peonies coming up in front of their grave. Now, again, seeing the peonies coming up, I was really excited because it looked like that was probably an older variety of peony and tied to some of the generations more closely connected with that set of grandparents. And I really loved that and I got excited. But then I looked over, not far from their gravestones, there was another set of peonies coming up that there was no stone sitting next to the stand of peonies. So, ooh, I went to the car and I got myself a tire iron and I started beating the ground or started poking the ground a little bit. And lo and behold, I discovered Mary's tombstone was in pieces just below the sod line. So I basically just peeled the sod back and there was her grave. Now, unfortunately, her grave went into the pile with the others. Really, I mean, I left it there specifically where the peonies were, but I suspect that it probably went into the pile. But that, I finally got some photographic evidence that she had been buried there, and that was really wonderful. But just keep in mind, those older stands or their older planting actually helped break that little brick wall as to where she was buried. They gave me the clue. Somebody planted the exact same flowers right on her grave. So, are they really there? That's a really creepy question to ask about your ancestors. But in our area, in the northern Kentucky and tri state area near Cincinnati, there was a really big problem with grave robbing back in the late 19th century. There were so many medical colleges in the area, and each one advertised that every student would have their own cadaver to dissect. Now, at the time, it was illegal to donate your body to science, and the only ones they could legally get their hands on were usually those who were unidentified and washed up in the river, or a criminal that was put to death. Anything like that was legal, but otherwise, the rest of it, where did they get them? Well, they actually paid very good money for local grave robbers to go and get them some cadavers for dissection. This problem was also very prominent in Scotland, actually. For some reason, that was an area where this was such a problem that there were devices that were invented to try to keep grave robbers from stealing the body. In fact, there are little shacks sometimes in cemeteries where people would stay up all night watching the gravestone to make sure that grave robbers didn't come and get the body. And in fact, in this case, you even see a grenade or what they call a grave torpedo on the left that was produced that would go off if a grave robber tried to breach the coffin. And in this case over here on the right, at the bottom right, there was also great fear of being buried alive. So if someone had been buried alive, since this is pre-embalming days, there was a rope placed in the hands of the coffin occupant, which could be pulled to ring the bell above ground. The cage at the top is one from Scotland, and that was one to try to deter grave robbing as well. So, quite a different problems that they had back then. Death and burial was not as easy or as straightforward as we like to think of it today. So, in my family, we had a rumor about this in the E. E. Barton papers, which that was a series of papers put together by an attorney in Falmouth, Kentucky, and he basically tried to gather the family history of everyone in the area. And we have a copy of those here on microfilm in at the Kentucky Historical Society, and I've used those many, many times for my family. But one of them was a letter written by a cousin of mine named Pearl Allender. She said, "My mother never did think that her grandfather, Samuel Cox, rested in his grave. For just in a night or two at 12 o'clock, a man left that grave with something wrapped in white lying across his horse in front of him. The man was a truthful man, and as a brother-in-law of my father, Newton Humble was the man. We always thought that it was old Dr. Thomas and that he probably took the body to Cincinnati and the medical college to find out what was the cause of his death." Now, the really important part about this, number one, I found it fascinating that they knew about this problem. I'm not surprised in a way. Obviously, I think people more in Cincinnati were going to be more familiar with this, but Lenoxburg Cemetery, and actually, this was not Lenoxburg, but this was not too far away. You're still looking at an area that was not too far away from the Ohio River. So, were these rural family cemeteries at risk of someone coming and robbing them as well, because it would be easy to then take it down to the river and ship it where it needs to go. I found this really interesting that she thought that that is what was going on, is that it was for the medical college. So that was in the family narrative, which I think is very significant for the region. Now, the kicker of the story is that he actually was still there, as far as we know. The couple was reinterred, let's see, in 2013 back up in Lenoxburg because of some road widening and because it was really deteriorating. And those who made that happen, actually the funeral director that was there that oversaw the movement of the bodies, actually they did. They said there was a skeleton down there. So, I'm not sure what was going on that night, and I can't 1,000% say for sure that it was our great 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 grandfather that's actually buried there, but it makes the story seem a little bit more far fetched since they did find remains there. Or maybe poor Newton was well, it was midnight. Maybe he'd had a little snifter there before he saw this image of this person go into the graveyard. Now, one last postscript to this story. The way that all of this problem stopped was they changed the laws so that they could legally acquire bodies and people could even donate their body to science. One of the sons of a former president was discovered after he was a young man. He had died in the Cincinnati area, and even though someone had been watching in the cemetery, his body went missing shortly after burial. And upon investigation, they found him hanging in the basement of the Cincinnati Medical College. And so that was so scandalous. It made so many headlines. Legislators knew that they had to fix this, they had to address this problem. It's actually President Harrison's son. So look that up in the Cincinnati area. That's some great reading. So, when it's time to actually go out to the cemetery, just think of this as an adventure and something that you have to prepare for because terrain can be difficult, weather might be difficult. So, there's certain things that you should prepare for to take with you on your trip. Photography equipment. Now, that's very easy today because we all have cameras on our phones. But I also take a more professional camera with me just so that once I get it back, if there was any kind of carvings that was a little bit hard to see, I can manipulate that photo really well and hopefully learn a little bit more about it. A mirror for shining light onto a stone. Now, remember, I talked about how water is okay if you want to pour some water over the surface to see if that will help you see it. But really, the best way is to get some sort of mirror for shining the light on the stone because then you can pretend like you're the sun and you can manipulate how the light and the shadows alter over the carvings, and you can usually see a little bit better there. Wear appropriate clothing. Think about insects and snakes and stability. How many times have I went through a cemetery in the wrong kinds of shoes, especially after a funeral? My goodness. If it's one of those cemeteries where there's a lot of family members, I'm dressed for a funeral. We've just had the graveside service and we all mull about a little bit, talking with each other. And the next thing I know, I'm hiking over the hill to take a look at another tombstone of an ancestor. So wear suitable shoes, long pants. Think about insects, especially if you're prone to getting a lot of bites. Sunscreen is always good. You never know how quickly that time actually passes. And what may seem like just a quick little trip out to a cemetery quickly evolves into a very lengthy trip. So take some sunscreen with you. Water, stay hydrated. There's a lot of excitement there. And again, we spend more time out there than we had planned all the time. So stay hydrated. A notebook, map, and app if you're going with something like Billion Graves and you wanted to GPS the coordinates of a specific grave, look into that ahead of time. Don't try to download that app right as you're parked and getting ready to get out of the car. That would be frustrating. So make sure that you do all of that planning ahead of time. Remember, I talked about the photography equipment and notebook. Map out the actual plots and the people around. So take some notes, draw where the specific graves are and how close they are to other people, because sometimes those people around your ancestors may be related to you in some way, and you may not know it until you get back. So stand around and make a little chart of what you've discovered. A walking stick for stability. I also take a little small cooler with paper towels and Ziploc bags and a Sharpie with some extra water. This is mainly for if you find a very old variety of rose bushes, the act of kindness you can do is prune out the dead wood that is in the middle and haul that away if you want to, but just make that a healthy plant. Sometimes when that comes off though, the dead wood, sometimes there can be a little bit of stragglers around the front, and then trim off or prune back some of that. Take those with you. You can actually root some of those when you get back. Now be careful, I'm not talking about true rose rustling. There is such a thing as rose rustling that you need to look up. Be careful. I'm talking about an act of kindness, not stealing plants. So there is a fine line, but I do take that with me just in case. And also, if I'm out in the area and I'm near a homestead or something and I see some older varieties, it's helpful that if you bring anything home that is living in the form of plant life, you've got a way to keep that alive by the time that you get home. So, for one last little gem of where to find burial information, this is a graveyard quilt that is in our collection here at the Kentucky Historical Society. It's very famous. So many people have asked to photograph this and have written about it and profiled it in exhibits. It's a really remarkable piece. Now, as you can see, the family plot or cemetery is in the very middle of the quilt, and that is where the coffins go once someone has died. So you can see the coffins at the bottom of the quilt or even at the top. She's placed them in various places and she's put people's names on each coffin. So when it's their time to die, she then unstitches that and she places it in the cemetery. Now, the intentions were great and that's what she had planned to do, but as you can see, she only got so far. There was only so many people, and that's because the family actually moved a little bit from time to time, and so not everybody was buried in the same location. So she had to stop with the plans there. And if you're looking genealogically, this is the Mitchell and the Stalcup family. That's a really great way to learn about where someone's buried, but a very unconventional way. I don't know of another one that was ever made like this. If you guys have heard of some other ones, shoot us a line. I'd love to hear about them. So that's about it with my presentation on researching cemeteries. Now it's time for you to go out there and get digging. I know the weather right now actually can be great in the fall for traipsing through cemeteries. And obviously, we have a pandemic going on. This is one of those adventures that you don't have to wear a mask. And you can get out there and it's extreme social distancing because you usually are just you and the other person that came with you and all of the tombstones that surround you. So enjoy, have fun, and we'll see you next time.